"I need a man by Sunday," the CEO told the single dad, and his reply left her. Some of you are going to think I'm making this up. I get it. I would have thought the same thing if someone told me this story 2 years ago. But every single word of this is real, and if you've ever been the guy who nobody takes seriously, the guy who shows up, does the work and gets overlooked anyway, then you're going to feel every single part of this. Let me set the scene for you. My name's Daniel Mercer. I'm 36 years old. I own a small AC cleaning and maintenance company called Clear Air Solutions. Just me and 2 guys I trust with my life, Tommy and Brent. We service commercial buildings mostly, offices, small corporate spaces, that kind of thing. Nothing glamorous. You pull up in a van that's got your logo peeling on the side, you haul equipment up service elevators, and you do the job. That's it. That's the whole thing. I've been doing this for 7 years. Started from literally zero. I mean actual zero, like borrowing my neighbor's truck to do my first job because mine was in the shop, and I couldn't afford the repair bill. Zero. I built this thing one contract at a time. Every single dollar I reinvested back into the business because I have a daughter. Her name's Lily. She's 8. She's got these wild, curly red pigtails, and she argues with me about everything like she's got a law degree. And she's my whole reason for all of it. Her mother walked out when Lily was 2. Long story. Not today's story. But just so you understand who I am when I walk into rooms, I'm not a man with connections or money or fancy titles. I'm just a dad trying to make sure the lights stay on and his little girl never feels like the world forgot about her. So, that Tuesday, we had a scheduled maintenance call at Harmon & Associates, one of those glass and steel high-rise buildings downtown, the kind where you sign 3 forms just to use the lobby bathroom. 40th floor, executive suite. The kind of contract we'd been holding on to for about a year and a half, and honestly, it was one of our better ones. Consistent, monthly. The building manager, a quiet older guy named Pete, always let us in without a fuss. That day, though, Pete wasn't there. Some new assistant met us in the lobby and took us straight up without the usual rundown. Tommy and Brent took the main server room and conference wing. I got the executive suite. Now, I'd been to that floor before, but always when it was mostly empty, early mornings or late on Fridays when the executives had already left. That day was different. It was about 10:45 in the morning. Fully alive. People moving between offices with tablets and coffee cups. Phones ringing. That low electric buzz of a place where people are making serious decisions with serious money. I knocked on the office at the end of the hall. The one with no nameplate, just a small brushed silver plate that said Executive Director. And nobody answered. The assistant had told me that office was cleared for service, so I went in. And I want to describe this office to you because I feel like it matters. It wasn't the biggest office I'd ever been in, but it was the most intentional one. Everything in that room felt like it had been chosen with purpose. The desk was this enormous dark walnut piece, completely clear except for a single leather notebook and a glass of water. One wall was floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. On the opposite wall, and I remember stopping for a second when I saw this, there were no degrees, no awards, none of the usual stuff you see in executive offices. Just one large black and white photograph of an older woman sitting on a porch steps laughing with her head thrown back. No frame, just mounted straight to the wall. I don't know why, but that one detail told me more about whoever owned that office than anything else could have. I set my equipment down, pulled on my gloves and got to work on the ceiling unit. It was a 4-head split system. 2 of the heads needed a deep filter clean, and the drainage lines on the back unit were partially blocked. Standard stuff. I was up on the step ladder, headphones in, music low, completely in my own world. I didn't hear her come in. I don't know how long she'd been standing there when I finally looked down and nearly fell off the ladder. I grabbed the unit to catch myself and accidentally knocked one of my brushes off. It clattered across her desk and hit that glass of water, which went sliding toward the edge. She caught it. One hand, no fuss, without even looking away from me. That was my first real look at Victoria Harmon. She was, okay, look, I'm going to describe her the way I actually saw her, not the way you describe someone in a movie. She was around 30, maybe 31, not tall, maybe 5'4", but she had this posture that made her seem taller than everyone in the room. Dark hair pulled back tight, not a strand out of place. She was wearing this deep charcoal blazer, and her eyes, I know this sounds weird, but her eyes were the color of a storm that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to rain. Like that gray-green right before everything breaks open. And she was looking at me the way you look at something that surprised you, but you're not ready to admit it yet. "You almost took out my water," she said. Not angry, just observational. Like she was noting it for later. "I'm sorry," I said, climbing down. "I didn't hear you come in. Let me get a towel. It's fine." She set the glass back on the desk, exactly where it had been. "Are you almost done?" "About 20 more minutes on this unit," I said. "The drainage line on the back head is giving me a little trouble, but I'll have it cleared before I leave." She nodded, sat down at her desk, opened the leather notebook, and just started working. Like I wasn't there. I went back up the ladder, put my headphones back in, kept working. About 15 minutes later, I heard her say something. I pulled one earbud out. "Sorry?" She looked up from the notebook. And this is the moment, guys. This is the moment I keep coming back to. I said, "Are you available this weekend?" I blinked. "For a service call?" "No." She put her pen down and looked at me with this absolutely unreadable expression, like she'd already made a decision and was just waiting for reality to catch up. "I need someone to accompany me to an event on Saturday evening. A black tie fundraiser. I need a specific kind of presence there. Someone calm, composed, not easily rattled. I've watched you work for the past 15 minutes and you have a quality I haven't seen in a lot of people. I'm prepared to compensate you well for your time." I just stood there for a second. "I mean, what do you even do with that? What do you say?" "I'm on a ladder in a woman's office. I've got dust on my hands and a drainage brush in my back pocket, and the person sitting behind that desk is looking at me like she's offering me a business proposition. The same way she'd probably talk to a contractor about a renovation project." "You're serious," I said. "I don't say things I'm not serious about," she replied. I came down the ladder slowly. I set my brush on the plastic sheet I'd laid out on the floor. I always lay out a sheet, old habit, keeps the mess contained. And I looked at her for a moment. Not rudely. I took a second. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She gestured for me to go ahead. "Why me?" "You don't know anything about me." "I know you showed up on time," she said. "I know you've been working for 20 minutes in a room you thought was empty, and you haven't cut a single corner. I know when you nearly fell off that ladder. Your first instinct was to make sure your equipment didn't damage anything in my office. And I know that right now, instead of jumping at an offer that most people in your position would have already said yes to, you're asking why." She tilted her head slightly. "That tells me a lot. I'll be honest with you. Part of me felt the pull of it. I won't pretend I didn't. I'm a 36-year-old single dad who budgets grocery trips and drives a van with a peeling logo. Someone like Victoria Harmon looking at you like you're worth something. That lands. It lands somewhere deep. But there was another part of me that felt something else. Not suspicion exactly. More like the feeling you get when you're holding a door and you're not sure yet if it leads somewhere you want to go." "What's the event?" I asked. "A fundraiser for the City Children's Hospital. Saturday evening, downtown Meridian Hotel. Dinner, speeches, a few hours of being present and professional. And why do you need someone to go with you?" A pause. First real pause since she'd started talking. "That," she said, "is a longer conversation." I looked at her for another moment. Then I bent down, started packing up my cleaning kit slowly, taking my time. I could feel her watching me. "Ms. Harmon," I said without looking up, "I appreciate the offer. I really do. But I'm not looking to be anybody's prop. I've got a daughter at home and a business to run, and I don't put myself in situations I don't fully understand." I zipped the bag, stood up, met her eyes. "If you want to have that longer conversation, genuinely, you've got my company's card. I'll think about it." And I walked out. I don't know what I expected. Maybe for her to call me back. Maybe for nothing. I took the service elevator down, loaded up the van, and sat in the driver's seat for about 2 minutes just staring at the steering wheel. Tommy knocked on the passenger window. "You good?" "Yeah," I said. "Just one of those days." I drove home, picked up Lily from school, made pasta for dinner. She told me about a boy in her class who kept stealing her colored pencils, and she was convinced it was on purpose to bother her specifically. I told her sometimes people do things on purpose and sometimes they just don't know better. And the trick is figuring out which one you're dealing with before you decide how to respond. She thought about that for about 4 seconds and said, "What if it's both?" I laughed, genuinely laughed. I didn't think much more about Victoria Harmon that night, but she thought about me. I just didn't know that yet. And I definitely didn't know what was waiting for me on the other side of that one conversation, or who was already watching from the shadows, getting ready to make sure none of it ever happened. She called the next morning, not through the company line, through my personal cell, which, by the way, I still don't fully understand how she got. I asked her about it later, and she just said, "I have a resourceful assistant," like that was a completely normal thing to say. Classic Victoria. It was 7:22 a.m. I know the exact time because I was in the middle of making Lily's lunch. Peanut butter and honey on whole wheat. Crust cut off because she's 8 and apparently crusts are a human rights violation. And my phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. I get a lot of spam calls, contractor solicitations, the occasional wrong number looking for someone named Gerald. But something made me pick up. "Mr. Mercer." No introduction. No, "Is this a good time?" Just my name stated like a fact. I knew the voice immediately. "Ms. Harmon," I said, wedging the phone between my ear and shoulder so I could keep spreading. "This is an early call." "I'm always in the office by 6:30, she said. "I figured you'd be up. You struck me as someone who starts the day before most people." I didn't know what to do with that, so I just said, What can I do for you?" There was a brief pause. Not awkward, just measured, like she was organizing her words before she released them. "You said if I wanted to have the longer conversation. I had your card. I'm calling to have it." I set the knife down, picked up the phone properly. "Okay. I need you to understand something first," she said. "I don't do this. I don't call contractors at 7 in the morning and ask them to attend events with me. I don't explain myself to people I've just met. But something you said yesterday stuck with me." "What did I say?" "You said you don't put yourself in situations you don't fully understand." Another pause. "I respect that. So I'm going to tell you what's actually going on, because I think you deserve the full picture before you make a decision." I leaned against the counter. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Lily at the kitchen table, fully absorbed in a drawing she was working on, her tongue poking out the side of her mouth the way it does when she's concentrating. I kept my voice low. "I'm listening," I said. And then she told me. The fundraiser Saturday wasn't just any event. It was the single most important social appearance of her professional year. The kind of night where deals got made between the salmon course and the dessert, where handshakes carried more weight than signed contracts. Victoria had been working for 2 years to close a partnership with a development group called Crestfield Capital, a firm run by old money, old values, and a board of directors that still believed, quietly, privately, in that way powerful people believe things they'd never say out loud, that a woman leading a company of Harmon's size was a novelty, not a norm. She'd been fighting that perception with results, with numbers, with performance that nobody could argue with. But Crestfield's lead partner, a man named Arthur Penfield, had made one thing clear through back channels. He needed to see stability. Not spreadsheets, not projections. Stability. The kind of life that told him Victoria Harmon wasn't just a machine in a blazer, that she was a full person, grounded, present. The kind of leader whose decisions came from somewhere real. She'd planned to bring someone, a colleague, a man she trusted professionally, someone who could hold a conversation with Arthur Penfield about golf and infrastructure and whatever else old money talked about over dinner. That man had backed out 48 hours before the call, and the reason he backed out, the reason she said with a very specific, very controlled kind of flatness in her voice that told me she was furious but had already processed it, was that someone had gotten to him first. What do you mean, gotten to him? I asked. I mean, someone called him, she said. Someone told him that being seen with me at this event would be professionally damaging, that there were things about Harmon and Associates that weren't public knowledge, that he'd be better off creating distance. She paused. He wouldn't tell me who called, but he was scared enough to cancel by text message. I was quiet for a second. Do you know who it was? I have a strong suspicion, she said, but suspicion isn't proof. I stood there in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, and I thought about what it must take for someone like Victoria Harmon to make this call, to explain herself, to ask. I'd seen enough of the world to know that people who operate at her level rarely ask for anything directly. They arrange, they position, they imply. The fact that she was just talking to me straight, no performance, no angle I could detect, said something. Why me specifically? I asked again. Same question as yesterday, but this time I meant it differently. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I wasn't expecting. Because you walked out. I frowned. What? Yesterday, I made you an offer, a financial offer, and you didn't ask how much. She let that sit for a second. Every single person I've made a direct offer to in the last 5 years has asked how much first thing, before anything else. You didn't. You asked why. A beat. I need someone who walks into that room on Saturday and makes Arthur Penfield feel like he's talking to a real person, not a transaction. And I think you might actually be one. I exhaled slowly. Here's the thing, guys. Here's the part that I've thought about 100 times since. I wasn't naive. I knew there was something else going on underneath all this. Some layer I hadn't seen yet. Some piece of the picture that hadn't shown up. But I also knew that what she was describing wasn't crazy. It wasn't manipulative, at least not in the way I was guarding against. She was a woman in a brutal position. Someone had deliberately pulled the floor out from under her, and she was trying to find solid ground before Saturday. I understood that feeling. I'd lived that feeling for years. I need to think about it, I said. Of course, she said, immediately. No pressure, no follow-up pitch, just, of course. And I'd need to arrange care for my daughter. A pause. You have a daughter? 8 years old, I said. Curly red pigtails. Strong opinions about pasta shapes. I don't know why I said that last part. It just came out. And there was this tiny sound on the other end of the line. Barely a sound, more like the absence of the controlled silence she'd been maintaining. That I can only describe as almost a laugh. Not a full one, just the edge of one. Caught before it escaped. I'll make sure you have everything you need, she said. Transportation, the details on Crestfield, background on Penfield. Whatever helps you feel prepared. I'll call you by end of day, I said. We hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. The toast had gone cold. Lily had abandoned her drawing and was now standing on her chair trying to reach the orange juice on the top shelf of the fridge. Lily, get down. I'll get it. I almost had it, she said, climbing down with great dignity. You almost had a head injury, I said. I poured her juice and sat across from her at the table, and for a few minutes I just watched her eat. She had this very specific way of eating cereal. She'd separate the pieces by color if it was the colored kind, eat the ones she liked least first, and save her favorites for last. Every single morning. She'd been doing it since she was 5. I once asked her why, and she said very seriously, because the good ones taste better when everything else is already gone. I thought about that a lot that morning. I thought about the 7 years I'd spent being the guy nobody noticed. The guy in the service elevator. The guy who signs in at the security desk and gets a visitor badge with a number instead of a name. The guy who built something real with his hands and his time and his absolute refusal to quit, and who still had to fight for every contract renewal like he was starting from scratch. And I thought about someone trying to take that apart. Someone who'd called Victoria's colleague, scared him off deliberately, methodically, and hadn't even had the guts to do it under their own name. I didn't know yet who that someone was, but I felt it. That specific low-frequency feeling you get when you know something's coming. Not fear exactly, more like that moment before a storm when the air pressure drops and everything goes a little too quiet, and your body knows before your brain does that something's about to change. I called my neighbor Sandra. Not the same Sandra from the other story some of you might have read. Different Sandra. Mine brings me casseroles and has a bumper sticker that says, "Namaste unless you're rude," and asked if she could watch Lily Saturday evening. She said yes before I'd finished the sentence. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and I called Victoria back. She picked up on the second ring. "Yes?" she said. "I'll be there," I said. "But I need you to do something for me first." "What's that?" "Tell me everything you know about who made that call, because if I'm walking into that room with you, I want to know what's already in the room waiting for us." There was a pause, longer than the others, longer than... And then very quietly she said a name, and I felt the floor shift under me, because I knew that name. I'd known it for 23 years. I want you to understand something before I tell you who it was. There are people in your life that leave marks. Not the good kind, not the kind your daughter leaves when she draws a heart on your hand with a marker, and you don't wash it off for 2 days because it makes you smile every time you see it. I mean the other kind, the kind that goes deeper than skin. The kind you carry around for years in a place you don't talk about, that shows up uninvited at 2 a.m. when the house is quiet and you're trying to sleep, and your brain decides that right now, tonight, is the perfect time to replay every moment you wish had gone differently. Richard Caldwell was that kind of mark for me. When Victoria said his name on the phone, I didn't say anything for what must have been a full 10 seconds. I just sat there at my kitchen table with my cold coffee and I felt something move through my chest that I can only describe as the feeling of a locked door opening in a room you forgot existed. All the air that had been sealed in there for years rushing out at once. "Mr. Mercer," Victoria said, "are you still there?" "Yeah," I said. My voice came out quieter than I meant it to. "Yeah, I'm here. You know him?" It wasn't a question. She'd heard it in my silence. "I know him," I said. And then, because I was standing in my kitchen on a Wednesday morning talking to a woman I'd met less than 24 hours ago, and because something about the way she'd spoken to me, straight, no performance, no angle, made me feel like the truth was the only thing worth offering back, I told her. Richard Caldwell and I grew up 2 streets apart in a neighborhood that had more ambition in it than money. We met when we were 13, at a summer job clearing lots for a landscaping company, and we became the kind of friends that only happen when you're young enough to be completely honest with each other. The kind where you say the real thing, not the polished version. We talked about what we were going to build, what we were going to become. We had this running joke that one day we'd both be running our own companies and we'd have offices across the street from each other, and we'd wave at each other through the windows every morning like idiots. Stupid, I know. But we meant it. We stayed close through our 20s. I started Clear Air. Richard went into corporate consulting, then investment, then started climbing the kind of ladder that has no visible top. He was smart, genuinely smart, the kind of smart that made you feel smarter just by being around him. He had this way of walking into rooms and immediately understanding the architecture of power inside them. Who deferred to whom? Where the real decisions were being made. He could read a room the way some people read a book, fast, thorough, and retaining everything. I admired that about him for a long time. I should have paid closer attention to what he did with it. When I was 30, my company was starting to grow. Real growth, not just surviving, but building. I had 6 employees, a fleet of 3 vans, contracts with 12 commercial buildings. I was putting together the paperwork to go after a city maintenance contract that would have tripled our revenue and let me hire 8 more people. It was the thing I'd been working toward for 3 years. Every decision I'd made, every dollar I'd reinvested instead of spending, every Saturday I'd worked instead of slept in, it was all pointed at that contract. Richard knew about it. He'd been one of the people I'd told when I was still just dreaming about it out loud. He'd sat across from me at a diner on a Tuesday night years before and said, "You're gonna get it, man. You've built something real. Nobody can take that from you." I believed him. The contract didn't go through. The official reason was a paperwork irregularity, some compliance documentation that had been filed incorrectly, a box that hadn't been checked in the right sequence, a form that referenced outdated licensing codes. The city clerk's office sent me a letter, very polite, very bureaucratic. I could reapply in 18 months, by which point 3 other companies had moved into the space I'd been building toward, and the market had shifted just enough that the window I'd spent 3 years working toward had quietly closed. I spent 6 months trying to figure out what had gone wrong. I went through every page of that application myself, twice. I hired a small business consultant, a woman named Renee who had reading glasses on a chain and the patience of a saint, and she went through it with me line by line. And here's the thing that never added up. The documentation was correct. Every form, every code, every compliance box, it was all right. Someone had filed a complaint, a formal procedural complaint, submitted anonymously through a third-party channel that triggered a secondary review and flagged inconsistencies that, under the lens of that specific review process, looked like errors even though they weren't. The review board had no obligation to dig deeper. They just followed the flag. I never found out who filed it. At the time, I told Victoria all of this, standing in my kitchen, one hand braced on the counter, voice steady because I'd had years to process it, but the steadiness costing me something even now. I told her about the company I'd had to scale back, the employees I'd had to let go, 2 of them, guys with families, guys who'd trusted me. I told her about the 18 months after that, rebuilding from a smaller base, taking any contract I could get, working 70-hour weeks while also being a full-time single dad to a 5-year-old who still sometimes cried for her mom at night and needed me to sit on the edge of her bed until she fell back asleep. I didn't tell Victoria the part about sitting in my van in the parking lot of a grocery store one night after dropping off Lily at school the next morning had felt impossible because I didn't know how I was going to keep all the plates spinning and just stopping, just sitting there for 20 minutes. Not crying, not thinking, just stopped, like a clock that needed rewinding. Some things you don't say out loud to someone you've just met. But I told her enough. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment. "When did you find out it was Richard?" she asked. "I didn't," I said. "Not until 30 seconds ago." Another silence. Different quality this time. "He told me," she said finally. Not directly, not as a confession. But 3 months ago at a dinner party, he said something, just offhand, the way people say things when they want credit without accountability, about how he'd once done a favor for someone in city procurement. Something about protecting the integrity of a bidding process. He laughed when he said it, like it was a funny story. I stood very still. "He laughed," I said. "He laughed," she confirmed. And her voice had something in it I hadn't heard from her yet. Not anger exactly, but the kind of quiet that comes after anger has already burned through and left something harder behind. Here's what I didn't tell her yet. What I hadn't gotten to in the story because some things come out in order and I wasn't ready for this part to come out yet. Richard Caldwell hadn't just sabotaged my contract. He'd also been sleeping with my wife. I didn't know it at the time. I found out 8 months after she left, from a mutual friend who thought I already knew, who said it with this horrible look of dawning realization on his face as he understood in real time that I did not, in fact, already know. My wife, Lily's mother, a woman I had loved completely and faithfully for 6 years, had been in contact with Richard for almost 2 years before she walked out. The timeline, once I started looking at it, told its own story. The distance she'd put between us during the same period the contract fell apart. The way she'd stopped talking when I walked into a room. The trip she'd taken to see her college friend in February, a friend who it turned out hadn't seen her that February. I'd never said any of this out loud to Richard. I'd never confronted him, because by the time I knew, he'd moved out of state for work, my wife was gone, and I had a 2-year-old daughter who needed me to be functional more than I needed to be furious. So I buried it. Not the healthy kind of buried, just the survival kind. The kind you do when falling apart isn't an option. So yeah, Richard Caldwell, the man who killed my contract, the man who cost me 8 employees at peak and 3 at the bottom, the man who, I now understood with the cold clarity of a Wednesday morning in my kitchen, had also worked from the inside to dismantle my marriage. And now here he was again, in the orbit of a woman I'd met yesterday, trying to pull floors out from under people, still laughing. "Ms. Harmon," I said, and my voice was calm. I want to be clear about that. It was completely calm, because the feeling moving through me wasn't the hot, explosive kind of anger. It was something colder and more deliberate. "I'll be at that event Saturday, whatever you need." A pause. "Can I ask what changed?" she said. I looked out the kitchen window. The maple tree in the backyard that Lily had named Gerald, don't ask, was dropping its early leaves in the wind, slow and unhurried, like it had all the time in the world. "Nothing changed," I said. "I just understand the situation better now." We made arrangements. She'd send a car at 7. She'd have a packet of background information on the Crestfield people messengered to me by end of day Thursday. I told her to keep it brief. I didn't need a dossier. I just needed to know enough to hold a real conversation without embarrassing either of us. Before she hung up, she said, "Mr. Mercer, Daniel, I want you to know that I don't take this lightly, what you're doing." "I know," I said. "I don't either." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long time. Long enough for the morning light to shift from the cool, flat gray of early day to the warmer, more honest light of mid-morning. Long enough for the coffee to go from cold to simply forgotten. I thought about a 13-year-old kid clearing brush in the summer heat, talking about the future with the kind of uncomplicated hope you can only have before the world shows you what it's actually made of. I thought about how sometimes the person you trusted most is the exact same person who built the walls around you, so quietly you didn't even notice until you'd spent years trying to climb out. And I thought about Saturday, about a room full of people who made decisions over dinner, about a man who laughed at other people's losses like they were interesting anecdotes. I didn't plan anything. I want to be clear about that too. I didn't sit down with a list, I didn't scheme, I just knew. The way you know when you've been patient long enough. The way you know when the moment is finally moving toward you instead of away from you. Sometimes life does its own accounting. And sometimes you just need to be in the room when it does. Saturday came the way important days always do. Quietly, without ceremony, acting like it didn't know what it was carrying. I woke up at 5:47 a.m. before my alarm. Lily was still asleep. I could hear her through the wall. She sleeps with a small fan on because the white noise helps her. Has since she was 3. And I just lay there in the dark for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, feeling the particular weight of a day that hasn't started yet, but already has momentum. I got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the packet Victoria had sent over Thursday afternoon. Her assistant, a young woman named Claire who had the energy of someone powered by cold brew and controlled anxiety, had dropped it off in a slim manila envelope with my name written on the outside in what I assumed was Victoria's handwriting. Clean, precise, slightly forward-leaning. The kind of handwriting that doesn't waste space. The packet was exactly what she'd promised. Brief, focused. Arthur Penfield, 64, third-generation old money, semi-retired but still the deciding vote on every major Crestfield partnership. Widower. One son who worked in environmental law in Portland and called him every Sunday. Fly fishing. Restorations of mid-century American furniture. A quietly held belief, according to a note Victoria had added in the margin in that same clean handwriting, that the best deals were made by people who knew how to be still. That last part I underlined. I also noticed, tucked at the back of the packet, a single sheet that wasn't about Penfield or Crestfield at all. It was a printout, an old one, slightly pixelated like it had been pulled from a digital archive, of a business profile piece, a trade publication from about 8 years ago. The headline read, "Young Consultant Richard Caldwell on Building Trust in Corporate Spaces." There was no note attached, no explanation. Victoria hadn't said a word about it in any of our communications since Wednesday. She didn't need to. I read it once, slowly. Richard looked younger in the photo. Same structured jaw, same deliberate smile that never quite reached his eyes if you knew how to look. But younger, less polished, still building the armor. The article quoted him extensively about integrity. about the importance of long-term relationships, about how the most valuable thing in business was your reputation, and how a smart person protected it above everything else. I folded the sheet carefully and put it at the bottom of the packet. I spent the rest of the morning being a dad. Lily woke up at 7:30 with spectacular bedhead and an immediate strong opinion about what she wanted for breakfast, which was waffles, specifically the ones with the blueberries inside, not the ones where you put the blueberries on top because, and I quote, "The ones on top are just decoration and decoration isn't breakfast." I made the waffles. We ate together. She told me about a dream she'd had involving a talking horse who was also a librarian, and I listened to the whole thing with complete seriousness because that is the social contract of being a parent. Around noon, Sandra came over. My neighbor. Namaste unless you're rude, Sandra. With her reading glasses already on top of her head and a tote bag full of craft supplies. She and Lily had an ongoing project involving model aircrafts made from recycled cardboard that I absolutely did not understand, but that Lily was deeply committed to. I thanked Sandra. She waved me off like I was being dramatic. I showered, dressed, and stood in front of my mirror in a way I probably hadn't in years. The suit was a navy wool blend I'd bought 4 years ago for a friend's wedding and worn exactly twice. It still fit. The shoulders were right. The jacket sat clean. But I'd had it pressed at a dry cleaner Thursday morning just to be sure. White shirt, no tie, because the notes had said black tie optional, and I'd made a deliberate choice to land on the optional side of that. Not because I couldn't do the tie, because walking into a room slightly less formal than everyone else, when you carry yourself right, sends a specific message. It says I chose this. It says I don't need the armor. I looked at myself for a long moment. I thought about Daniel Mercer at 30, sitting in a parking lot in the dark, running on empty. I thought about Daniel Mercer at 36, standing in his bathroom mirror, going somewhere that mattered. I exhaled. Fixed one shirt button, left. The car Victoria sent was a dark charcoal sedan, clean and quiet, driven by a man named Oscar, who had the professional bearing of someone who had seen enough interesting things in his career to be completely unshakable. He nodded when I got in and didn't make small talk, which I genuinely appreciated. I watched the city move past the window and I kept my breathing even and I thought about still water. We picked up Victoria at her building, a sleek residential tower 3 miles from her office. I got out to meet her, which felt like the right thing to do, and when she came through the lobby doors I had about 2 seconds to recalibrate every mental image I'd been carrying of her since Tuesday. She was wearing a deep midnight blue gown. Not showy, not loud. The kind of dress that understood that the person wearing it was the statement, not the fabric. Her hair was down for the first time, dark and straight to her shoulders, and she'd left most of her face bare except for a dark lip. She walked the way she always walked, like the floor was exactly where she'd decided to put it. She looked at me. I looked at her. "You clean up well," she said. "So do you," I said. She almost smiled. "Shall we?" The Meridian Hotel downtown was the kind of place that made you feel slightly underdressed regardless of what you were wearing, with ceilings that seemed to go up about 4 floors past where they needed to, and lighting that was warm enough to be flattering and dim enough to be strategic. The fundraiser occupied the entire East Ballroom, round tables in ivory linen, centerpieces that managed to look effortless in the way that only very expensive things do, a live quartet in the corner playing something I recognized but couldn't name. The room was already half full when we arrived. Victoria moved through it with a fluency that was something to watch. She knew the geography of every conversation, when to stop, when to keep moving, when to let a smile do the work, instead of words. She introduced me simply, every time, as Daniel, a colleague, and I understood immediately that this was intentional, that the ambiguity of it was the point, and I played it exactly right, which meant I just acted like a person instead of a role. I talked to people, real conversations. An architect from the hospital's building committee who was passionate about acoustic design in pediatric spaces. I knew more about HVAC systems in medical buildings than most people in the room, which turned out to be surprisingly useful. A woman who ran a mid-sized logistics company and spent 15 minutes telling me about her father's garage workshop where she'd learned to fix engines. I listened. I asked questions. I was genuinely interested, which is the only version of interested that works. Arthur Penfield found us about 40 minutes in. He was shorter than I expected, stocky with a broad face and a handshake that told you immediately how he felt about character. White hair, heavy silver watch, a dark green tie that had probably been expensive 30 years ago, and had been worn so many times since that it had become something better than expensive. He had the eyes of someone who'd spent a lot of time outdoors looking at distances, that slight permanent squint that comes from years of reading horizons. He shook Victoria's hand first, warmly, like he genuinely liked her and was still making up his mind about something. Then he turned to me. "And you are," he said, not unfriendly, just direct. "Daniel Mercer," I said. "I run a commercial maintenance company, Clear Air Solutions." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that. "You in this world long?" 7 years building it, I said. "Started with a borrowed truck and one contract." Something shifted slightly in his face. "Not dramatic, just a small recalibration. What kind of contracts do you run now?" "Commercial mostly, 12 to 15 buildings at any given time. We're small, but we're precise. Every job I take, I can tell you exactly what my team did and why 3 years later." He looked at me for a moment. Really looked. "That's a specific kind of pride," he said. "It's the only kind I know how to have," I said. We talked for a while, about building things, about the difference between growing fast and growing right, about his son in Portland briefly, because he mentioned him and I asked a real question about it and he answered with the soft, particular warmth that fathers have when someone asks about their kids without an agenda. Victoria stood slightly beside me the whole time, contributing when it was natural, letting the conversation breathe when it didn't need her. And I could feel it, the way the dynamic in that small circle was settling, the way Penfield was relaxing into the conversation instead of evaluating it, the way his posture, about 20 minutes in, stopped being the posture of a man conducting an assessment and became the posture of a man simply talking. I don't know exactly when I became aware that Richard was in the room. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where the music stopped or the lighting changed. It was just that particular shift in the air I told you about, that low-frequency thing. And I looked up from a conversation with Penfield about fly fishing spots on the Gallatin River and scanned the room once. Calmly, and there he was, across the ballroom. Dark suit, that same structured jaw. Older than the photo in the packet, more polished, the armor fully assembled now. He was talking to a group of 3 men near the bar, animated, his hands moving the way they always had when he was performing. Because that's what it always was with Richard. A performance. And I'd just been too close to it for too long to see the stage. He hadn't seen me yet. I looked back at Penfield. Kept talking. Kept my voice exactly level. Said something about the way fish behave differently in moving water versus still water, and how you had to adjust your whole approach based on what the current was doing underneath. Penfield pointed at me and said, "Exactly right. Most people never figure that out." I nodded, and from the corner of my eye, I watched Richard turn and find my face across the room and go completely still. The glass in his hand, something amber, whiskey probably, stopped moving halfway to his mouth. I watched every muscle in his face do that rapid, invisible reorganization that happens when someone sees something they didn't expect, and their brain is running 3 calculations simultaneously. Recognition, confusion, something close to fear, dressed up quickly in something else before it could be seen. I didn't look away from him, I didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't give him anything at all. I just looked at him the way still water looks at a stone someone just threw into it. Present. Unchanged. Already absorbing the impact. He was the first one to look away. And in that moment, just that quiet, unhurried moment, I felt something settle inside me that had been unsettled for a very long time. I turned back to Arthur Penfield. "You were saying," I said, "about the Gallatin in September. I want to tell you something about men like Richard Caldwell. They can't leave well enough alone. That's the thing about people who operate the way he does, who built their whole identity on being the smartest person in the room, on being 3 steps ahead, on pulling strings from positions nobody else can see. When something happens that they didn't orchestrate, when a variable appears that they didn't account for, they don't step back and reassess. They don't have the humility for that. Instead, they lean in. They double down. They convince themselves that the answer to an unexpected problem is more control, more pressure, more interference. It's the same instinct that made Richard what he was. And it's the exact same instinct that was going to undo him. I knew he was going to approach us. I felt it coming the way you feel a change in weather. Not a specific thought, just a physical awareness that something was shifting in the air around you. I kept my attention on Penfield and Victoria, kept the conversation real and grounded, but some part of me was tracking the room with that low, quiet radar you develop when you've spent years doing jobs where your attention has to be split cleanly between what's in front of you and what's going on around you. Richard moved through the room the way he always moved, with that particular fluency of someone who had spent so long performing confidence that it had calcified into something that looked from a distance exactly like the real thing. He stopped twice on the way over, said something to a man near the centerpiece display, shook a hand, laughed at something, all of it deliberate, all of it building the approach so it wouldn't look like an approach. He arrived at our small circle with the smile already on. "Arthur," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." Penfield shook it with the brief, measured grip of a man who is polite by default and reveals nothing until he decides to. "Richard, good to see you." Then Richard turned to Victoria. Something moved behind his eyes when he looked at her. Complicated, layered, the kind of look that has history in it. "Victoria, you look wonderful." "Richard," she said. Exactly that. One word, flat as a table. And then he turned to me, and I watched him do the thing I'd been waiting for. The reorganization happened again, faster this time, more controlled, but I knew his face and I caught it. He'd had 20 minutes to prepare for this moment since he'd seen me across the room. And he'd used those 20 minutes to build a version of himself that could walk into it smoothly. "Daniel," he said, like we were old friends at a casual reunion, like the word was warm and easy and carried nothing underneath it. "Man, it's been a long time." "It has," I said. I shook his hand. Firm, brief, neutral, gave him nothing to read. "You two know each other?" Penfield asked. "Just curious, the natural question." "Old friends," Richard said, before I could say anything. "Grew up in the same neighborhood. Haven't seen each other in what, 6, 7 years?" "Something like that," I said. "What are you doing these days?" Richard asked me, and his tone had that specific texture, friendly on the surface with just the faintest edge underneath, like a tablecloth laid very precisely over something you're not supposed to notice. It was the tone of a man who already knew the answer and was asking the question to establish a frame, to position me. "What are you doing these days?" Meaning, let's remind everyone in this circle exactly where you stand. "Running my company," I said. "Clear Air Solutions. Commercial maintenance. We've been growing well." "Great," he said, nodding. "That's great, man. Good for you." 2 sentences. Both of them technically positive. Both of them landing in the air with the weight of a door being closed. Good for you. The 3 words most specifically designed in the English language to say the opposite of what they say. I watched Penfield's face. Just a flicker. The faint narrowing that comes when someone with good instincts detects a frequency they don't like but can't quite name yet. Richard turned slightly toward Penfield, a physical redirect so smooth you'd almost miss it. "Arthur, I wanted to reach out to you this week, actually. I've been looking at the Crestfield fund structure and I had some thoughts about the Western portfolio that I think could be interesting. Do you have a few minutes before dinner?" And there it was. I understood it immediately. The whole geometry of it. Come in through warmth, neutralize me with 2 sentences, redirect Penfield's attention toward a private conversation, physically separate him from Victoria before the evening could do what Victoria needed it to do, pull the floor out from under her again. Same move as before, just executed in real time instead of through a phone call. Penfield glanced at his watch. "I've got about 10 minutes before I need to find my seat," Walk with me to the bar. Richard nodded, touched Penfield's elbow lightly, the classic guiding gesture of someone who steers people without them noticing, and began to move. And then Penfield stopped. He turned back to our small circle and looked at me directly. Daniel, you said you started with one contract and a borrowed truck? Yes, sir, I said. Come with us, he said. I want to hear more of that. It was such a simple thing. Just an old man who liked talking to people who had built something real. But I watched Richard's face in the half-second after Penfield said it, and I saw something crack open behind his eyes before he sealed it back up. The four of us moved to the bar together. Victoria stayed close, reading the room the way she always did, contributing precisely when it was useful. Richard recalibrated in real time. I could see him doing it, shifting from the plan he'd walked in with to an improvised version, which was always more dangerous because improvised Richard was sharper and less predictable. He spent the first 5 minutes talking to Penfield about the Western portfolio, and it was genuinely impressive. He knew his material cold, spoke about it with the fluency of someone who'd prepared extensively, and Penfield was engaged. I let it run. I wasn't there to interrupt or compete. I just stood slightly to the side, held my drink, and listened. Then Richard made his mistake. It was subtle. If you didn't know him, you would have completely missed it. Penfield had made an observation about the risk profile of one of the Crestfield holdings, a mid-sized infrastructure project in the Northwest. And Richard, comfortable now in his element, said something that I think he didn't fully intend to say out loud. Honestly, Arthur, risk profiles are only as accurate as the information going into them. Most people don't account for what you can control on the front end. The real advantage is knowing which variables to manage before they become public. Penfield looked at him. Not sharply, just looked. With those outdoor eyes that had spent years reading distances and making quiet judgments. Manage how, Penfield said. And Richard, 1/2 second too confident, said, strategic positioning. Making sure the right people have the right information at the right time, and the wrong people. He paused, adjusted, smiled. Don't create unnecessary noise. Silence. About 3 seconds of it. Then Penfield nodded slowly and said, in the tone of a man who has just made a private decision and will not be revising it. I took a small sip of my drink and looked at the middle distance and did not say a single word. I didn't need to. What happened next, though, that I didn't plan? That was Richard. Running out of controlled options and switching to the one tool he'd always reached for when everything else was slipping. Direct attack. He waited until Penfield had excused himself briefly to speak with someone from the hospital board. Just 2 minutes, he said, and the moment the old man's back was turned, Richard looked at me with the smile completely gone. What are you doing here, Daniel? Not a question. A statement with a question mark forced onto it. Having a conversation, I said, with Victoria Harmon. He said her name the way you'd reference a piece on a board, a position, not a person. She invited me, I said. Something moved through his jaw. This isn't your world, man, you know that. You walk into rooms like this and you think it's about being genuine and straightforward and all that, but it's not. It's complicated, and you're going to get in the way of things you don't understand. I looked at him for a moment. Took my time. Richard, I said quietly, do you remember the summer we cleared lots on Fenner Street? You and me, we were maybe 13, and it was about 100 degrees, and we worked all day, and at the end of it we got paid, and we sat on the curb, and you said, I still remember this exactly. You said, the only thing worth building is something that's actually yours. He stared at me. Something moved in his face that wasn't the armor. Something older. Something from before the armor existed. I never forgot that, I said. Did you? A long moment. Then Victoria appeared at my shoulder. She'd been close enough to hear. Her face was composed, but her eyes were doing something I hadn't seen from her before. Not anger, not triumph, something quieter and more serious than both. Richard, she said, I think your table is on the other side of the room. He looked at her, then at me, then back at her. and in the space of that one look I saw it. The full picture of what Richard Caldwell was, and how he'd gotten there, and what it had cost him. Not money, not position, something you can't buy back once it's gone. The ability to be in a room with people who are real and feel like one of them. He straightened his jacket, walked away without another word. I watched him go, all the way across the ballroom, back to his side of the room, back to the performance. Penfield returned 2 minutes later with a small plate of appetizers he'd picked up from a passing server. He offered one to Victoria, one to me, took one for himself and said, "Now, Daniel, the borrowed truck. What kind of shape was it in?" I almost laughed. "Terrible shape," I said. "The AC didn't work." Penfield did laugh, a genuine one. Full and unguarded, the kind that comes from somewhere real. Victoria looked at me from the side, and in her eyes was something I didn't have a word for yet, something that was still deciding what it was. We sat for dinner 20 minutes later. Penfield requested that his seat be moved to our table. His assistant made it happen in about 4 minutes. Richard spent dinner at a table across the room with his back partially to us. I saw him check his phone twice before the first course was finished. I saw him lean toward the man beside him and say something low, and the man nodded and Richard's jaw tightened, and he was recalculating. I could feel it from 30 feet away. And here's the thing about men who always have another move. They always make it. Even when they shouldn't. Even when the board is already turning against them, and the best thing they could possibly do is sit still and stop. They can't. Because for men like Richard Caldwell, the only thing more unbearable than losing is not trying to win. By the time dessert came, I knew he was going to do something before the night was over. I just didn't know yet that it would be the move that finally, permanently, sealed his fate. Dessert was a dark chocolate tart with a raspberry center that I only half tasted because by that point, every sense I had was quietly, calmly oriented toward the room around me. Not tense, not anxious. More like focused the way you get when you've been doing a complicated job long enough that your body just settles into it automatically. Hands steady, breathing even, aware of everything without reacting to any of it. Penfield was talking about his son again. The Portland one, the environmental lawyer. Apparently the kid had just taken on a case involving watershed rights in eastern Oregon, and Penfield was simultaneously proud and deeply confused by the specifics of it. Victoria was asking thoughtful questions. She had that quality I was learning of making people feel like whatever they cared about was genuinely worth caring about, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than most people realize. Under the table, her hand had found the edge of my jacket sleeve twice during dinner. Not dramatically, just briefly, the way people touch something solid when they need a quiet moment of grounding. And both times she'd pulled back quickly like she wasn't sure she'd meant to do it. I didn't say anything about it, just stayed present. Richard had gone quiet across the room in the way that loud people go quiet when they're building pressure. I'd glanced over twice casually, and both times he was deep in conversation with the man beside him, late 50s rectangular face, silver cufflinks that caught the light, the kind of man who looked like he made decisions about other people's money for a living. I didn't know who he was yet. That detail mattered later. The speeches started after dessert. Hospital board chairman, a couple of major donors, a pediatric oncologist who spoke for 4 minutes without notes and made half the room cry, including Penfield, who wiped his eye with the corner of his napkin in a way that suggested he'd done it before in this room and wasn't embarrassed about it. I respected that. A man who can be moved in public without feeling diminished by it is a man who's settled something important inside himself. When the speeches ended and the room loosened back into conversation and movement, Victoria leaned slightly toward me and said quietly, "Penfield asked his assistant for your company's contact information during dinner." I looked at her. "He didn't mention it to you?" she said. "No," I said. She nodded once, and something at the corner of her mouth moved in a way that on anyone else would have been a full smile. On Victoria, it was the equivalent of a standing ovation. I should have let myself feel that more in the moment. I know that now. But the thing that was moving toward us across the room hadn't arrived yet, and some part of me was still waiting for it. It arrived in the form of Richard Caldwell and the man with the silver cufflinks, approaching our table together with the particular coordinated energy of people who have just agreed on something. Richard stopped at the edge of our table. Penfield looked up. Victoria looked up. I looked up. "Arthur," Richard said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. I wanted to introduce you to someone." He gestured to the man beside him. "This is Warren Fitch. He's been with the Delacroix Group for 12 years. They're the firm I mentioned earlier regarding the Western portfolio restructure." Penfield extended his hand. "Warren, I know the Delacroix name." "Mr. Penfield," Fitch said, "it's genuinely an honor. Richard's told me a lot about you. And then, and this is the part I want you to pay attention to, because this is where Richard made the move I'd been waiting for, the one that was going to cost him everything. He turned to me. Not to Victoria. To me. Specifically, deliberately, in front of Penfield and Fitch, and anyone else close enough to hear. "Daniel," he said with a smile that was constructed so carefully it almost looked real. "Warren was asking about some of the vendors in the Harmon building network. Apparently there were some compliance questions raised recently about a maintenance contractor, something about improper chemical disposal reports filed with the city. I'm sure it's nothing, but Warren thought you might be the right person to—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The damage was in the setup, not the conclusion. In front of Arthur Penfield, who was evaluating Victoria's entire professional world. In front of Warren Fitch, who was connected to money and would carry this moment into other rooms. The implication was fully loaded in those two sentences. Compliance questions, improper chemical disposal, maintenance contractor, all of it pointing without ever saying my name explicitly, directly at me, and by extension at Victoria for bringing me here. It was elegant in the way that a knife is elegant, designed for a single purpose. The table went quiet. I felt Victoria go very still beside me. Not the stillness of someone frozen, the stillness of someone making an extremely fast decision. But before either of us could speak, something happened that Richard had not accounted for. Penfield put his napkin on the table, set his hands flat on either side of it, and looked at Richard with those horizon-reading eyes. "Richard," he said in the quiet, unhurried tone of a man who has been building something private for the last 2 hours and has just decided to share it. "What you just said? Do you have documentation for that?" Richard blinked. It was raised to my attention by whom? "A contact in the city licensing office." "A contact," Penfield said, not repeating it, weighing it. "Arthur, I'm only raising it because due diligence—" "I appreciate due diligence," Penfield said. "I also appreciate knowing where information comes from and why it's being brought to me at a dinner table rather than through proper channels." He looked at Richard for a long, level moment. "In my experience, Richard, when someone volunteers damaging information about another person in a social setting, there are two possible explanations. Either they genuinely believe the information and have the standing to present it properly, in which case they do exactly that, properly, or they have a different reason for wanting that information in the room." He picked up his water glass. "I've been in business for 40 years. I can usually tell the difference." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. You could feel every person at the table breathing. Richard's jaw was working, just slightly, just enough. "Mr. Fitch," I said, and my voice came out level and clear. "My company's compliance documentation is current and complete. I'd be glad to have it sent to you directly on Monday morning if there's any genuine question. Every filing, every inspection report, every city certification for the last 7 years." Fitch looked at me, then at Richard. Something was moving behind his eyes. A recalibration. "That would be fine," he said carefully. "And while we're at it," Victoria said, and her voice had that particular quality now, the one I'd heard on the phone. That flatness that came after the anger had already burned through and left something harder and more precise in its place. "I'd like to know which contact in city licensing has been sharing information from our building's vendor files, because that would be a significant data breach and it would require a formal inquiry." She looked directly at Richard. Unless, of course, the information didn't actually come from licensing at all, in which case we'd have a different kind of problem. Richard said nothing. And that nothing, that specific, loaded, irretrievable silence, was the moment. That was the crack in the foundation that everything else fell through. Warren Fitch cleared his throat quietly and said, "I think I may have misunderstood the situation." He looked at Richard. "I'll let you two sort this out." He nodded to Penfield. "Arthur, good to meet you." He walked away from the table with the focused directness of a man removing himself from something before it got on him. Richard stood there alone at the edge of our table. I want to describe his face to you because I spent years imagining what it would feel like to see Richard Caldwell without his armor on, and the reality of it was nothing like what I expected. I always thought it would feel like satisfaction, like something hot and vindicating, but it didn't feel like that at all. He looked tired. That's the truest way I can say it. Not embarrassed, not afraid, though both of those were in there somewhere, but mostly just tired. The way a person looks when they've been holding a particular weight for so long that they can't remember what it felt like not to carry it, and some part of them is almost relieved to be forced to put it down. He looked at me, and I looked back at him, and I said, quietly, just for him, not for the table, not for Penfield or Victoria or anyone else in that room. "You were right, you know. The only thing worth building is something that's actually yours." He held my gaze for about 3 seconds, then he walked away. I watched him cross the ballroom, watched him pick up his jacket from his chair, watched him say something brief to the person beside him, an explanation or an excuse, I couldn't tell from that distance. And then I watched Richard Caldwell, the man who had dismantled my contract and my marriage in my 20s and laughed about it like it was an interesting anecdote, walk out of that room. He didn't look back. Penfield exhaled slowly beside me and said in the tone of someone commenting on weather, "I've known that man for 4 years. Never could quite put my finger on it." He picked up his fork. "I think I've put my finger on it now." Victoria didn't say anything for a moment. Then she reached for her water glass and her hand was not entirely steady, just slightly, just enough that I noticed and understood what it cost her to sit as still as she had through all of that. Under the table, without making anything of it, I moved my hand to the edge of her chair. She didn't pull away this time. The rest of the evening was quieter, not empty. Penfield stayed until nearly 11, which his assistant later told Victoria was unusual for him, that he typically left by 9. He and I talked for a long time about what it actually takes to build something from nothing, about the specific texture of the years when you're not sure it's going to hold, about what you learn about yourself in those years that you can't learn any other way. At some point, Victoria joined the conversation, and I watched her, this woman who ran a company with 40 employees and negotiated deals that moved real money, talking about her grandmother, who had run a small alteration shop for 30 years and had more dignity per square foot than anyone Victoria had ever met in a boardroom. I thought about the photograph on her office wall, the old woman on the porch steps laughing. I understood that photograph now. Oscar picked us up at 11:15. The city was quiet in that particular way it gets late on Saturday. Not empty, just different. The daytime version of itself packed away and something more honest left in its place. Victoria sat beside me in the back seat and we were both quiet for a while. The good kind of quiet. The kind you can only have with someone after something real has happened between you. "He's not going to recover from tonight," she said eventually. Not with satisfaction, just as a fact. "No," I said. "No, he's not." She was quiet for another moment. The compliance complaint he tried to reference. I had my legal team look into something similar 2 weeks ago when I first suspected it was him. There was a filing. Anonymous. Same pattern as what happened to your city contract. I looked at her. "I was going to tell you before tonight," she said. "But I wanted to wait until I had something more solid." She met my eyes. "I have something more solid now." His voice, his words, in front of Arthur Penfield and Warren Fitch. Fitch is going to go back and tell people what he saw. That's how Richard's world works. The same network he used to move through is the one that's going to carry this story now. I nodded slowly. "There's also something else," she said. She reached into her small clutch and produced a folded piece of paper, thicker than regular paper, the kind that comes from a legal pad. She held it out to me. I unfolded it. It was a copy of an internal memo, dated 8 years ago. Harmon and Associates letterhead, which meant Victoria had found it in her own company's archives. It was addressed to a city procurement liaison, referencing a procedural complaint filed against a vendor. Complaint number, date, signature. The signature was Richard Caldwell. He'd filed it on company stationery, his company at the time, a consulting firm he'd been running, which meant there was a paper trail. A real one. Not anonymous. His name, his firm, his letterhead, connected directly to the complaint that had killed my city contract. I sat with that piece of paper in my hands for a long time. The car moved through the quiet streets, and I sat there holding 7 years of unanswered questions in a single folded sheet, and I felt something shift inside me that I don't have a clean word for. Not relief exactly. Not closure in the way people use that word like it's a door that clicks shut. More like the specific feeling of a weight you've been carrying so long you stop noticing it, suddenly absent. Your body, knowing before your brain does that something it had been compensating for is no longer there. "What do you want to do with it?" Victoria asked. I looked at her. "It's yours," she said. "I found it. But it belongs to you." I folded the paper carefully, put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, right against my chest. "I'll talk to a lawyer Monday," I said. She nodded. "Victoria," I said. She looked at me. "Thank you." She held my gaze for a moment with those storm-colored eyes, the gray-green of a sky that's already made up its mind, and said, "Don't thank me yet. I just handed you a document. You were the one who showed up." We pulled up to her building. I got out, walked her to the lobby doors. The doorman nodded and stepped back to give us a moment. She turned to face me. "I'd like to have dinner," she said. "Not an event, not a strategy. Just dinner. With you." I looked at her for a moment in the amber light of the lobby entrance, this woman who had caught a glass of water without looking, who kept a photograph of an old woman laughing on an unframed wall, who sat completely still while someone tried to pull the floor out from under her, and waited until exactly the right moment to speak. "I'd like that," I said. She nodded once. Then, just before she turned to go inside, she did something I wasn't expecting. She reached up briefly and touched my jaw with the back of 2 fingers. The lightest possible thing, barely a contact, more like a comma than a period. And then she was gone through the glass doors. I stood there for a second. Then I smiled. Not the performed kind. Not the kind you put on for rooms. The kind that comes from somewhere so far down you can't manufacture it. The kind Lily has when she saves her favorite cereal pieces for last and finally gets to eat them. I got back in the car. Oscar glanced in the rearview mirror. He had the expression of a man who had driven a lot of people home from a lot of evenings and knew exactly what kind of night this had been. "Home, Mr. Mercer?" he said. "Home," I said. I got back at 11:45. Sandra was asleep on my couch under the throw blanket with a crafting magazine open on her chest, snoring very quietly, which I felt bad about for about 2 seconds and then decided was fair compensation for being the best neighbor in a 3-mile radius. I checked on Lily. She was asleep on her back with one arm thrown over her head and the other wrapped around a stuffed rabbit named, inexplicably, Professor Buttons. Her wild red curls were everywhere on the pillow. The small fan hummed its white noise into the room. I stood in the doorway for a while. 7 years ago, I sat in a parking lot in the dark and couldn't figure out how to keep moving. 7 years of early mornings and late invoices and service elevators and being the guy nobody looked at twice. 7 years of building something that was actually mine, piece by piece, contract by contract, dollar by dollar, one borrowed truck at a time. Richard Caldwell spent those 7 years thinking he'd closed a door on me. What he actually did was force me to build my own. The legal process took about 4 months. Victoria's documentation combined with a deposition from the city procurement liaison, a man who, it turned out, had been carrying the guilt of what he'd done for years and cooperated fully once the paper trail made denial impossible, was enough to establish clear grounds for damages. Richard's consulting firm, The one that had filed the complaint had since been folded into a larger corporate structure, which meant the liability ran upstream. The settlement wasn't a number I'll put in writing here, but it was enough to pay off every remaining debt on Clear Air Solutions, fund the expansion I'd been planning for 3 years, and put a college fund in Lily's name that she will find out about on her 18th birthday. Richard's professional network, the one Victoria had predicted would carry the story of that Saturday night. She was right. Fitch went back and talked. Penfield, in his quiet and permanent way, simply stopped returning Richard's calls. Within 6 weeks, Richard had lost 2 board seats and a consulting retainer that had been the backbone of his income for 4 years. He relocated out of state by spring. I heard through a mutual contact that he was rebuilding somewhere smaller, which felt more like a beginning of the right story for him than an ending. Though I admit I'm more generous about that now than I was in the months right after. The Crestfield partnership closed for Victoria in February. Arthur Penfield signed off personally. And dinner, the one Victoria asked for outside her lobby. And just dinner, no strategy, happened on a Thursday night 3 weeks after the gala at a small Italian place in the West Quarter, with mismatched chairs and a handwritten menu, and a candle and a wine bottle that dripped wax onto the tablecloth while we talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing and all the real things in between. She met Lily 6 weeks after that. Lily interrogated her for 11 minutes about her opinions on pasta shapes, which, for the record, Victoria passed, and then showed her the cardboard aircraft project, and Victoria sat on the kitchen floor in her good jeans and helped glue a wing strut in place without being asked. I watched that from the kitchen doorway, and I thought about what Lily had said about the cereal. The good ones taste better when everything else is already gone. She's 8 years old, and she already knows the most important thing. I don't know what the next chapter looks like exactly. I'm not someone who maps too far ahead anymore. I did that once. Had the whole picture planned out, and life came along and rearranged it, and I spent years putting the pieces back in a different order. The order they're in now is better, even if I couldn't have drawn it in advance. What I know is this. I've got a daughter who argues with me like she's got a law degree and saves the best things for last. I've got a company that is actually mine, built from zero, built right. I've got a woman in my life who catches glasses of water without looking and keeps photographs of joy on her walls without frames. And I've got the specific quiet satisfaction of knowing that the man who spent years trying to make me invisible ended up being undone not by anything dramatic or explosive, not by a confrontation or a revenge plot or anything cinematic, but simply by being exactly who he was. In a room full of people who were paying attention. That's the thing about character, yours and theirs. It always, eventually, shows up. That's all I've got. If any of this landed for you, if you're one of those guys who's been carrying something heavy and building something real and wondering if it's ever going to count, I just want to say, stay in it. Stay steady. Do the work. Be the kind of person who doesn't cut corners in an empty room. The right people notice. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, life does its own accounting. And when it does, you want to be in the room.